I'm known for two main things: making videos about how War Thunder can be improved, and making videos about historical inaccuracies. Contrary to popular belief, I do not think that realism equals better. A game obviously has to be fun before it's realistic, unless you're playing a hardcore simulator, I guess. However, I think Gaijin can make some changes that be both realistic and improve the gameplay overall. It's just that usually, they're too minor to have their own video, so I'm combining them into one. Without further ado, let's get into it. First up, if you play the Striker, Merkavas, Type 89, or other vehicles with frontally mounted engines and thermals, this is likely a common annoyance for you. Hot exhaust from the engine blocks your thermal sight, making you effectively blind along a decent portion of your frontal arc. This seems somewhat plausible, right? FLIR picks up thermal radiation, so hot stuff will obviously interfere. There is a slight problem with that though. Air is a terrible thermal conductor. Speaking realistically, your engine will have a bright glow to it, but there won't be a giant column of hot smoke that telegraphs your position, and it won't mess with the thermal sight either. I've been able to confirm this with tankers. By Gaijin's own logic, it doesn't really make sense. ESS can be seen through perfectly, but exhaust can't? Removing exhaust from thermals make these vehicles less frustrating to play, with the added bonus making berm drills a viable tactic. Moving on, Gaijin surprisingly gets a lot wrong with ammunition. You'd think they would have it down pat by this point. First, APHE. Everyone knows how incredibly effective it is in-game. Even when heat or APDS shells are available, I'll still use APHE. You don't get as much penetration, but it almost always one-shots. That is more than worth the trade. In War Thunder, it functions like so. It penetrates, goes a short distance, then explodes, sending shrapnel flying everywhere in the tank's interior. The shrapnel flies out more or less a perfect sphere, meaning that very little aiming is required most of the time. In reality, it's very different. When the shell explodes, the shrapnel flies out in a cone, not a sphere, meaning that the damage is a bit more localized. I seem to recall that in a study, between Solid Shot and APHE there is very little difference. The damage was very similar. I don't think that would be good for the game, since it would make APHE mostly redundant, but APHE's damage should be scaled back a bit. Funnily enough, some APHE does behave correctly in War Thunder. APHE on Swedish vehicles mostly explodes out in a cone. Some shrapnel still flies back, but the effect is pretty noticeable. It seems like Gaijin did it as a trial run, then just never pursued it. I have no clue why, because it feels perfect in my opinion. And speaking of overperforming ammo, after the overpressure mechanic, high explosive is way too strong. Basically, no matter how big the shell is, if you manage to penetrate a tank with high explosive, it will kill the entire crew, even if there's a ton of space between them. The issue is that when they hit the plate, they spend a lot of energy getting through that plate in the first place, even if it is relatively thin. So the damage is a bit more localized than you might expect. Obviously KV2 should be one-shotting, but a Sergeant York shouldn't. On the opposite side of the spectrum, there's APCR, which doesn't do nearly enough damage. In War Thunder it does practically no spall damage whatsoever, so barely anyone bothers taking it. If you can't penetrate a tank frontally, you're better off disabling and flanking. In the real world, it did as much damage as regular AP. Damage is more a function of mass and velocity, but in-game, each shell type has its own damage preset. APCR used to do more damage, and it also didn't have horrible slope modifiers. The problem was the APCR was too meta, but instead of taking a more cautious route, like limiting how much you could take, Gaijin gave it the classic double nerf, wrecking both the damage and angle performance. Next up, there's fuel explosions. These have become extremely deadly recently. Most fuel tanks behave like ammo racks, at least on Russian tanks. Fuel explosions are a serious hazard for vehicles, but the vast majority of the time, they're not going to instantly destroy it. Fuel explosions are a rapid conflagration, better known as a fireball, not very similar to a grenade or bomb. If Gaijin did maul them accurately, the crew would receive a fair amount of burn damage. They would also have to fight the fire quickly, otherwise the fire would overtake the vehicle. And finally, traction. Everyone already knows about this, but it's so annoying that I'm going to talk about it anyway. Tanks were developed because they offered two main things: low ground pressure and more traction. Tanks are known for tackling rough terrain, so when a tank in War Thunder can't climb a slight hill, there is a serious problem. As far as I can tell, every tank in US service can climb a 60% slope. Here's an idea of what that looks like. Instead of simply blocking off exploitable map areas, now every tank has to suffer. Anyway, that's all there is to it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.